In May of 2024, I was standing in front of my students at Moonshot Academy in Beijing. No cameras, no studio, no audience, just a classroom, a whiteboard, and a prediction that I had spent years building from the ground up. I told them Donald Trump will win the 2024 election. I told them a second Trump administration will go to war with Iran. And then I told them something that almost nobody in Washington, nobody in Tel Aviv, nobody in the mainstream media was willing to say out loud. I said, America will not win that war. My students looked at me the way students always look at a teacher who says something that sounds insane. Some of them shifted in their seats. A few of them smiled. One of them asked me if I was serious. I told him I am always serious. That is the entire point of predictive history. What happened next, you already know, because you are here, because the world caught up to what I laid out on that whiteboard 2 years ago, and because millions of people are now asking the same question my students asked me that day. How did he know? My name is Professor Jiang. I have spent decades studying the structural forces that drive history, the game theory underneath the surface of events, the patterns that repeat across centuries, regardless of which names and flags appear on top. Today, I am going to take you inside the framework, not just the predictions, but the engine that produced them. Because what is happening right now in the Strait of Hormuz, in Washington, in the Gulf, is not a surprise. It was never a surprise. It was inevitable. Let me show you why. Most people consume history the way they consume news. They watch events happen, they are shocked, they react. Then the next event happens, and they are shocked again, and they never stop to ask the fundamental question, why does this keep happening? I call my channel Predictive History because I believe, and I have believed this for a very long time, that history is not simply a record of the past. It is a structural guide to the future. The name comes partly from Isaac Asimov, the science fiction writer who imagined a science called psychohistory, a mathematical discipline capable of predicting the behavior of large populations over long periods of time. Asimov's insight was that while you cannot predict what one individual will do, you can predict with reasonable accuracy what a civilization will do when it is placed under specific structural pressures. I am not Asimov. This is not science fiction, but the underlying logic is sound. What I combine is this: structural historical analysis, which means I look at the deep patterns of how empires rise and fall, how reserve currencies collapse, how military overextension plays out across centuries. Game theory, which means I ask what the actual incentives are for each player in a given situation, not what they say their incentives are, but what the structural logic forces them to do. And real-world data, market signals, geopolitical positioning, military procurement, the things that tell you what governments are actually planning regardless of what they say in press conferences. When you combine these three lenses, the world becomes far more legible than the daily news cycle suggests. Let me walk you through exactly how I built the Iran prediction. Because it did not come from intuition, it did not come from ideology, it came from following the logic wherever it led. I first laid out what I call the Iran trap in May of 2024. At that point, Joe Biden was still president. Donald Trump had not yet survived 2 assassination attempts. The idea of a direct American military strike on Iran seemed remote to most mainstream analysts. And yet, when you looked at the structural forces in play, the outcome was not remote at all. It was close to inevitable. Here is the core logic. Every major player in this equation, and I mean every single one, had structural incentives that pointed toward war. Start with Israel. The strategic goal of Israeli leadership, and I'm talking about the structural logic here, not the stated justifications, has been to eliminate every regional military power capable of challenging Israeli dominance. Hezbollah has been significantly degraded. Hamas has been decimated. The Houthis are under pressure. The last major remaining strategic obstacle is Iran itself, specifically Iran's nuclear program and its missile capabilities. The logic of Greater Israel as a strategic project requires that obstacle to be removed, not preferred, required. Now look at the Trump administration. When I analyzed the incentive structure of a second Trump term, what I saw was a president who needed a dramatic foreign policy achievement, who was deeply aligned personally with Israeli leadership, who had walked away from the Iran nuclear deal in his first term and imposed maximum pressure sanctions, and who was surrounded by advisors and donors who had been pushing for direct confrontation with Tehran for years. The game theory of that political position pointed toward escalation, not because anyone is irrational, but because escalation served the structural interests of every key player inside that administration. Now look at Iran itself, and this is the part that people find most counterintuitive. Iran, at the structural level, also had incentives that pointed toward conflict. Iran has been living under maximum pressure sanctions for years. Its economy has been severely damaged. Its currency has collapsed. Its population has been restless. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the ideological core of the regime, has an eschatological worldview in which a final confrontation with what they call the Great Satan is not something to be feared. It is something that has been anticipated, prepared for, and in certain ways, welcomed as the crucible that will prove the revolution's legitimacy. Iran has also spent 20 years preparing asymmetric capabilities specifically designed for this confrontation. Cheap drones, proxy networks across the region, missile stockpiles. The strategy was never to match American conventional power directly. The strategy was to make the cost of conflict unsustainable for the other side. When three players all have structural incentives pointing in the same direction, that direction becomes the path of least resistance. That is not prediction. That is game theory applied to observable facts. Operation Epic Fury launched on February 28th of 2026. I had been warning about it since May of 2024. Now we come to the part that generates the most controversy. My third prediction was not just that the war would happen, it was that the United States would not prevail, that this would become a prolonged war of attrition, grinding down American military capacity and financial resources, accelerating the very decline of American global hegemony that Washington was trying to prevent. Let me explain the structural logic behind that conclusion. The first dimension is what I call the economic ledger of asymmetric warfare. An Iranian suicide drone costs between $20,000 and $50,000 to produce. A single American interceptor missile, a Patriot, a THAAD, cost between $1 million and several $1 million. In one documented engagement during the Red Sea crisis, 11 interceptor missiles worth over $100 million combined were used to destroy a single drone. This is not a military problem. This is a mathematical problem. Iran and its proxies can produce drones at industrial scale. The raw materials are cheap. The manufacturing is not complex. The supply chain is resilient. America's interceptor missile stockpile, on the other hand, took decades to build and cannot be replenished quickly. The industrial base that produces them is not structured for the consumption rate that a sustained conflict demands. Every exchange at these ratios drains American military capacity faster than it can be replaced. That is not speculation. That is production economics. The second dimension is the geographic vulnerability of the Gulf states. People think the vulnerability of American allies in the Gulf is oil. It is not. Oil infrastructure can be repaired. The true vulnerability is water. Most major Gulf cities, Dubai, Riyadh, Kuwait City, Doha, depend on desalination plants for the majority of their drinking water. These plants are large, fixed, coastal installations. They are visible from satellite imagery. They are not hardened military targets. They are civilian infrastructure sitting on open coastlines. If sustained conflict in the region disrupts or damages this infrastructure, you are not looking at economic damage. You are looking at existential crisis for some of the world's wealthiest cities. That leverage changes the entire strategic calculation of America's Gulf allies. It changes how long they are willing to host American military infrastructure. It changes how much political pressure they are willing to absorb. It changes everything. The third dimension is what I have been calling the petrodollar pressure. For 50 years, the global oil trade has operated primarily in American dollars. Gulf producers sell oil in dollars. They recycle those dollar revenues into American treasury bonds, American real estate, American financial markets. This arrangement creates constant structural demand for the dollar as the world's reserve currency. It is the hidden architecture beneath American financial power. When the Strait of Hormuz was closed, even briefly, global oil prices surged past $100 a barrel. That surge does not just hurt consumers. It accelerates conversations that have been happening for years among major oil producers about whether the petrodollar arrangement still serves their interests. Russia, China, and significant portions of Gulf leadership have been building alternative payment frameworks specifically designed to reduce dollar dependency, a prolonged conflict, one that keeps the strait unstable, one that repeatedly threatens Gulf infrastructure, accelerates those conversations. And once those conversations reach critical mass, the dollar's structural advantage begins to erode in ways that compound every other American economic problem. America's national debt is now approaching $40 trillion. The interest payments alone are consuming an unprecedented share of federal revenue. A sustained Middle East war that drives energy prices higher, strains interceptor stockpiles, and accelerates de-dollarization is not a manageable pressure on top of those existing conditions. It is a multiplier that compounds everything simultaneously. That is the Iran trap. Not one mechanism, three mechanisms operating at the same time, each feeding the others. As I record this, the situation on the ground confirms everything I laid out in my structural analysis. The ceasefire that was supposed to stabilize the Strait of Hormuz is already fracturing. American forces have struck Iranian targets multiple times in response to drone attacks on commercial shipping. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has retaliated against American military installations in Kuwait and Bahrain. Trump has issued statements warning that Iran's continued existence cannot be guaranteed if escalation continues. This is exactly the pattern I predicted. Not a clean, decisive victory, not a rapid regime change, a grinding, iterative escalation cycle where neither side can fully disengage and where every exchange makes the next escalation more likely rather than less. The Iranians have been preparing for this for 20 years. In their religious and strategic worldview, this confrontation was not something to be avoided. It was something to be survived and endured until the cost became unsustainable for the other side. They watched what happened in Ukraine. They watched how cheap drones, produced by a country with a fraction of America's GDP, exhausted some of the most sophisticated air defense systems in the world. They drew conclusions. They prepared accordingly. I said in my original lecture, this war will be very similar to the war in Ukraine. A war of attrition where the side with strategic patience and cost tolerance outlasts the side with superior firepower, but a shorter political horizon. Iran has 20 years of sanctions-induced strategic patience. America has a domestic political cycle that runs on 4-year intervals and a public that has already watched trillions spent in Iraq and Afghanistan, with nothing durable to show for it. The structural math has not changed. Let me now give you 3 scenarios for where this conflict goes, because predictive history is not about certainty. It is about mapping the probability space honestly. The most likely near-term path is what I call managed attrition. Both sides continue exchanging strikes at a level that maintains domestic political narratives on each side, without crossing the threshold into full-scale conventional warfare. America continues degrading Iranian military infrastructure. Iran continues targeting commercial shipping and American military positions in the Gulf. The ceasefire exists on paper but is violated repeatedly in practice. In this scenario, the economic costs accumulate slowly. Energy markets remain elevated but not catastrophically so. The petrodollar pressure builds gradually. American interceptor stockpiles decline quarter by quarter. The financial system remains intact for now, but the structural foundation weakens in ways that are not immediately visible until they suddenly are. This scenario is painful for everyone and resolves nothing. It is also the path of least political resistance for both Washington and Tehran. The second scenario is the one I consider most dangerous. If American air power alone proves insufficient to achieve regime change, and the evidence so far suggests it is, the political pressure to introduce ground forces becomes very difficult to resist. Everyone says that deploying American ground troops into Iran would be the worst possible outcome. Everyone said the same thing about Iraq in 2003 and Afghanistan in 2001. Iran's terrain is not Iraq. It is mountainous. It is vast. The population has been conditioned for decades to view outside military intervention as an existential threat to the nation, regardless of how they personally feel about the government. The history of great powers attempting to impose military solutions on the Iranian plateau does not contain encouraging examples. Ground deployment would trigger the full asymmetric warfare scenario I have been describing. It would accelerate every pressure on American financial and military capacity simultaneously. It would be the strategic trap closing completely. The third scenario, and the one I believe is ultimately inevitable even if it takes years to arrive, is a negotiated restructuring of the regional order. Not because anyone wants it, not because there is goodwill on any side, but because the structural math eventually forces every player to the table. America cannot sustain indefinite military commitment at this cost level without triggering the financial crisis it is trying to avoid. Iran cannot sustain indefinite conflict without some pathway to economic reintegration. The Gulf states cannot sustain indefinite instability without addressing their fundamental infrastructure vulnerabilities. The world that emerges from that negotiation will not look like the world of 2015 or 2000. It will be a genuinely multipolar world, in which American power remains significant but no longer dominates the global architecture the way it has for the past 30 years. That transition and the turbulence it produces is what I believe we are living through right now. I want to say something directly to you before I close. I know that what I describe is unsettling. I know that watching a system you depend on, the global financial architecture, the stability of energy markets, the assumption of American dominance that has organized the post-Cold War world begin to show serious structural cracks is deeply uncomfortable. But I do not think fear is the correct response. I have never believed that. I grew up poor. My family left China at the end of the Cultural Revolution with almost nothing. My father cooked food in a restaurant. My mother sewed clothes. I went to school. I read history. I learned that the forces that disrupt the world are not random. They follow patterns, and patterns, when you understand them, can be navigated even when they cannot be stopped. Understanding what is happening is not pessimism, it is preparation. It is the only rational response to a world that is genuinely and irreversibly changing. History tells us that transitions between world orders are dangerous, but they are not permanent catastrophes. The world reorganizes, new structures emerge. The question is never whether change is coming. The question is whether you understand what is changing and why, so that you can think clearly while everyone else is simply reacting. That is why I teach. That is why I built this channel, not to frighten people, but to give them the map. The map does not make the terrain less difficult, but it makes the journey possible. If today's analysis gave you something real to think about, to share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read them. And the question I want you to sit with today is this. Given everything I have laid out, the asymmetric cost dynamics, the petrodollar pressure, the strategic patience of Iran versus the political cycles of Washington, do you believe the United States can find a sustainable exit from this conflict? Or is the trap already closed? Tell me what you think. I am Professor Jiang. I will see you in the next one.